Welcome, everybody, to this debate. We're looking forward to giving you a good discussion that's going to happen between two really sharp minds on the subject. We're glad to have you on this episode. Make sure you hit the like button for this one. Share it on your favorite platform. Also, make sure you hit subscribe if this is your first time to Facts. Welcome, everyone, to today's debate. The discussion is, did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John really write the four Gospels? I'm your host, Dr. Stephen Boyce. We're joined by two distinguished guests, Dr. Bart Ehrman, New Testament scholar, best-selling author, and also Jonathan Sheffield, an autodidact Anglican researcher. Today, we're going to explore one of the most pivotal questions of Christian origins: who actually wrote the gospel accounts? So thank you for joining us. I'm going to bring on the screen our guests who are here with us today, Dr. Bart Ehrman and Jonathan Sheffield, and I'm going to introduce them. As we get into the discussion, I'll also go over the rules. So we have Jonathan down here at the bottom. He hails from Brooklyn, New York area. He was born and raised in the Anglican Communion as a member of the Episcopal Church. He's a veteran of the armed forces, having served 4 years in the United States Air Force. While Jonathan holds an MBA and an undergraduate degree in his coursework of computer science, accounting, and statistics, he's also an autodidact in the church for history and Christian apologetics. Since the year 2016, he has participated most notably in debates such as defending the reliability and thesis of the New Testament and the Holy Scriptures, including engagements with Rabbi Tovia Singer, Dr. Bart Ehrman earlier as well, Dr. Mark Goodacre, Dr. Robin Walsh, Dr. Richard Carrier, Dr. Josh Bowen, Matt Dillahunty, and many other PhDs in their field of expertise. Jonathan's goal in these dialogues is to share his thesis from an Anglican perspective and receive valuable feedback. So, Jonathan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Bart Ehrman is a James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he has taught since the year 1988. He's recognized internationally for his scholarship on the New Testament and early Christianity. Professor Ehrman has written or edited 33 books, including 6 New York Times bestsellers. His college-level textbook, The New Testament, A Historical Introduction to the Early Christian Writings, has remained the best-selling text in the field for more than 25 years. His scholarly works have been published by Oxford, Harvard, Yale, and other premier academic presses, and his books have been translated into over 27 languages, reaching millions of readers worldwide. Beyond the classroom, Professor Ehrman is widely recognized as a public scholar. He's produced 9 acclaimed courses for the Great Courses, in addition to numerous online courses available through bartehrman.com, which I'll have a link for that as well for you to click on. His books and courses have sold more than 2 million copies. He also writes for his charitable blog, the Bart Ehrman blog, which has raised millions for organizations addressing poverty, homelessness, and hunger. In addition, he hosts the weekly podcast, Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman, available on YouTube and all major podcast platforms, where it brings cutting-edge biblical scholarship to a global audience. Thank you, Dr. Ehrman, for joining this debate.
No, it's my pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Yes, yes. All right, here's some of the rundown for the audience so you know what's going on here. Each participant, starting with Jonathan, is going to start with a 20-minute opening statement. They're going to go back and forth, and it'll be Dr. Ehrman. Then we're going to move into a participation of just going after each other's arguments. There's going to be a rebuttal for 10 minutes by each of our guests. There'll be 10 minutes. And again, we'll be a little loose with some of the time. If they go over a few seconds, it won't be the end of the world. We'll give 60-second extensions there. Then there's going to be 2 rounds of cross-examination, roughly 10 to 12 minutes. Jonathan will start that, and then Dr. Ehrman, and then we'll go through a second round of doing that. And then at the end, there will not be a closing statement by either of the guests. We're actually going to take your questions. Now, I want to give clear instructions very, very quickly on that. Please, if you're going to send a question, tell us who it is directed at, or we're going to assume it's for both. If you want it for both, please clarify that. Put @facts. Also, your super chats will go through. Those will be guaranteed questions. If it's not a super chat, I will do my best. we're on a strict timeline, so I cannot guarantee it. All right. We're going to start with our openings, and I'll take everybody else off stage. It'll be Jonathan going first. He's going to take himself off mute. Jonathan, you have 20 minutes. I will be timing you, and we will go into the next phase.
Okay, thank you. Well, to begin my dialogue with Dr. Ehrman, it is essential to note that the nature of the question before us is not a novel one. In fact, it was a focal point of examination during Augustine of Hippo's discourse with the Manichaean luminary Faustus at the end of the 4th century. To provide greater context for today's discussion, it is vital to understand the procedural precedent established from this discourse. In this debate, Faustus argued that the New Testament documents Augustine cited against him were not written by an apostle, but by an impostor using his name, and therefore the testimony lacked credibility. In response, Augustine tests Faustus' allegation by walking through the legal framework used to identify and authenticate common documents in the ancient world. Augustine begins his argument by asking the following questions. Where will you find any authority, if not in the gospel and apostolic writings? How can we be sure of the authorship of any book if we doubt the apostolic origin of those books, which are attributed to the apostles by the church, which the apostles themselves founded, and which occupy so conspicuous a place in all the lands? To that end, how do we know the authorship of the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Varro, and other similar writers, but by the unbroken chain of evidence? How is authorship ascertained in each case, except by the author having brought his work into public notice as much as possible in his own lifetime, and by the transmission of that information from one to another in continuous order, the belief becoming more certain as it becomes more general up to our own day, so that when we are questioned as to the authorship of any book, we have no difficulty in answering? Augustine initially provides us with 3 key takeaways. Firstly, the same procedural precedent we apply in determining the authorship of other common texts in antiquity is the same method set for the Gospels. In other words, there is no double standard. Secondly, Augustine's reference to an unbroken chain of evidence pertains to the chronological documentation or paper trail that records the sequence of custody, control, and transfer of physical evidence. Thirdly, the author's publication of a common text and its transmission results in echoes of extrinsic evidence, leaving behind archival fingerprints that we can analyze to trace the work's origin and author. Next, Augustine explains how the precedent provides safeguards and controls against potential agents who might publish literature under the guise of prominent authors, thereby aiming to boost the work's notoriety and credibility. In one such example, Augustine states, "Were not some books published lately under the name of the distinguished physician Hippocrates, which were not received as authoritative by the physicians? And this decision remained unaltered in spite of some similarity in style and matter." Augustine explains that the physicians precluded these works based on the following objective criteria. The texts were not known during Hippocrates' era, nor is there any corroborative statement from the author, his known associates, or pertinent witnesses regarding the publication. Furthermore, there exists a continuous succession of testimonies referencing the books from the time of Hippocrates to the present day, which makes it unreasonable either now or hereafter to doubt his official writings. This provides an objective standard. Ultimately, Augustine's Synopsis provides testable and measurable criteria by which we can historically conclude an author's identity. If we apply Augustine's criterion to the classical work titled On the Nature of Things, a didactic poem widely attributed to Lucretius, we will see that the method is legally sound and provides a credible answer, despite the paucity of contemporary evidence. Applying the first element, we ask if there's any empirical documentation from those present or near the time of Lucretius to determine whether he is the true author of On the Nature of Things. The answer is yes. In a letter from Cicero to his brother Quintus in 54 BC, Cicero states, "The poems of Lucretius are as you write. They exhibit many flashes of genius and show great mastership. Second, was this information transferred through successive generations and to distant times? Again, the procedure leads us to an affirmative answer. Specifically, several historical figures either quote or reference Lucretius' poem. This includes Quintilius, Tacitus, and Marcus Aurelius. Because Lucretius was critical of religion, his poem was disparaged and commented on by most early church fathers. While the two principal surviving manuscripts of On the Nature of Things were only rediscovered in 1417, does a review of the documentary evidence point to any other author than Lucretius? If not, the only logical conclusion is that Lucretius is the author of this title. Therefore, we should be able to apply the same procedural precedent that led to the identification of Hippocrates and Lucretius as authors of their respective works, to trace when and where the four Gospels of the Apostolic were written and by who. As Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Caius were able to name some of the authors and provide details for the formation of the so-called Gnostic texts. Remember that the procedural precedent advanced by Augustine underpins fundamental legal principles in contemporary evidence law, including the rule of corroboration, natural custody, and chain of custody. It was the substantiation of these legal doctrines that convinced the great intellectuals and legal voices of the ancient era, such as Augustine, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Eusebius, Jerome, among others, to accept the conclusion that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were authors of the four Gospels. Proceeding to our first legal principle, the rule of corroboration stipulates that material facts must be proven by evidence from at least two independent sources. By way of illustration, Arian of Nicomedia, in his project to construct an empirical history of Alexander's campaigns, applied this principle. For wherever Ptolemy and Aristobulus gave the same account, Arian followed it on the assumption of its accuracy. This principle is further emphasized by Dr. Ehrman, who states that multiple attestation is one of the most important historical criteria for establishing what happened in the past. If there are several sources available that independently indicate that an event happened, then no one of them could have made it up, since they all report it without having conferred with one another. The Church Fathers do not only echo Dr. Ehrman's sentiments, but also employ the same legal argument in their case for the Gospel authors. In particular, Augustine, in his treatise against the Manichaean, uses the rule of corroboration to defend the authenticity of the Gospels, writing, "Shall I, when I have a writing which I see spread far and wide for a length of time, and sanctioned by the concordant testimony of churches scattered all over the world, degrade myself by doubting? For the utter overthrow of all literature will follow, and there will be an end to all books handed down from the past, if what is established by the uniform testimony of so many men and so many times is brought into such suspicion that is not allowed to have the credit and authority of common history." Consequently, the histories of Eusebius, Jerome, Chrysostom, Augustine, Origen, and others demonstrate that common history from Rome, Asia Minor, Assyria, India, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Antioch, North Africa, Greece, and other regions all witness to the same four writings while naming the same authors. This would be conclusive in any normal court of law. Additionally, Irenaeus, the Bishop of Gaul, a witness to at least 3 apostolic sees, argued from the same legal basis against the Gnostics, stating that the tradition of the Gospels, that is, of the apostles, that is, the Gospels, made clear in all the world, can be clearly seen in every church by those who wish to behold the truth. This objective observation provides independent attestation of different churches across a broad geographical area in many languages that witness to the same writings and name the same authors. In contrast, the Gnostic factions exhibited divergent religious texts with conflicting accounts of authorship. Likewise, the esteemed Roman jurist and presbyter of Carthage, Tertullian, on the opposite side of the Roman Empire, independently corroborates Irenaeus' objective observation within the apostolic churches, appealing to the apostolic sees of Galatia, Philippi, Asia Minor, Rome, and others as objective testimonial evidence independently attesting to the gospel authors in his treatise against Marcion. While Dr. Ehrman will undoubtedly question the independence of the attestation provided by the apostolic churches, courts recognize that under the rule of cooperation, sources from different origins, such as those represented among the Greek, Latin, Coptic, and Syriac apostolic churches, are less likely to share the same biases, motives, or misinterpretations, thereby reducing the likelihood that their unified testimony on the gospel authors would be based on a fabricated account. It was these cognitive and psychological influences that contributed to the decision of all the bishops of Asia to follow the traditional custom handed down to them regarding the celebration of Passover, rather than conforming to the ancient Western tradition recognized by the parishes in Rome, Corinth, Jerusalem, and others. This emphasizes the independent character of the churches and their unwillingness to compromise for the sake of unity. And matters regarding the canon and authorship were no exception, as demonstrated in the judicial disputes of 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, the Epistle to the Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation among the Greek, Latin, and Syriac apostolic churches. Unless Dr. Ehrman has evidence of collusion, the testimony of the apostolic churches at this juncture is at least sufficient to raise a presumption of fact. The next legal doctrine relevant to our case of authorship is widely recognized as the ancient documents exception to the hearsay rule, which primarily stems from court decisions addressing certain recitals and documents, such as deeds and will, that affect interests in both real and personal property. Courts have clarified the rule by noting that it is generally impossible to prove the ancient ownership of property through the testimony of persons with knowledge of the facts. When a deed that is part of a chain of title is so old that there's no living witnesses who can testify to the acts of ownership by the grantor or grantee, it still may be admitted into evidence without such proof if it can be shown prima facie that the document came from the proper custody. Documents found in a place in which and under the care of persons with whom such papers might naturally and reasonably be expected to be found, or in the possession of persons having an interest in them, are in precisely the custody which gives authenticity to documents found within it. Additionally, a forger cannot usually secure the documents placed in such custody. So the fact that the document originates from the proper and natural place tends to eliminate presumption of fraud and reinforces the belief in its authenticity. Lastly, the church records fall under the purview of this law, as evidenced by the cases I cited below. Now, it is evident from the de facto amicus briefs of Tertullian and Irenaeus that the legal framework of such a case in the ancient setting was being litigated at the end of the 2nd century between the apostolic churches and the Gnostics regarding property rights to the official writings of the apostles, that is, their last will and testament, reflecting the teachings meant to instruct the Christian churches. Tertullian's complaint in his initial pleadings against Marcion and Valentius articulated the following claim. This, I say, is my property. I have long possessed it. I hold sure title deeds from the original owners themselves to whom the estate belonged. I am an heir to the apostles, just as they carefully prepared their will and testament and committed it to a trust and adjured the trustees to be faithful to their charge, even so do I. Despite Marcion's and Valentian's corresponding assertion, Tertullian and Irenaeus provided factual support for the Gospels, demonstrating that they are found in a place of natural custody. That is, where the writings of Peter, Paul, John, Mark, and others would reasonably be expected to be found, such as in the churches they founded in Rome, Greece, Asia Minor, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and other jurisdictions, and in the care and custody of their successors, bishops, elders, and deacons, appointed to oversee the official churches of the apostles. This certainly demonstrates fidelity to the law. Given Tertullian's evidentiary foundation that the Gospels are found in a place of natural custody and in the possession of persons having an interest in them, namely the bishops, elders, and deacons, it provides further evidence for the Apostolic Church's claim that the gospel records they possess are indeed the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, just as the records found in the natural custody of Shakespeare's colleagues from the Globe Theatre, Henry Condell and John Hemingway, lend authenticity to the claim that the first folio is the work of Shakespeare. Progressing to our third legal argument, which will also reinforce our previously established principles, Augustine asked, why would we deny the ability of the Church of the Apostles to collect and transmit their writings to posterity, considering that the original seats of the apostles have been occupied by a continuous succession of bishops to the present day? Augustine rightly appeals to the apostolic polity, the form of government upon which the churches were established and organized, providing a system for the transfer, control, and custody of the writings of the apostles received into its possession. Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Eusebius bear witness to this fact, confirming that the apostolic churches can establish a legal chain of custody, proving that the gospel records were always in the custody of a person designated to handle it, for which it was never unaccounted for. A record of the chain of title was maintained in all the churches, whereby the bishops, elders, and other clergy members who had charge of the Gospels could testify to the receipt of their original transaction. This enabled the churches to make a positive identification from whom the property transfer was collected from among its independent jurisdictions in the first century. When Marcion denied the Apocalypse as a product of St. John, Tertullian redirected his attention to the objective fact that we have the foster churches of St. John, and the order of bishops thereof, when traced up to their origin, will rest on John as their author. And the selfsame process inherent in the apostolic churches also provide evidence to the identification of the Gospels. Likewise, Irenaeus affirms, we can enumerate those who were established by the apostles as bishops and churches, and their successors down to our time. And evidence of such records from the apostolic sees of Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, and Jerusalem was published in the ancient world to substantiate this claim. The evidentiary value of this testimony is compelling. Firstly, it establishes a clear chain of title tracing ownership of the Gospels from the original grantors, that is, the apostles, to the current owner. Records that Irenaeus and Tertullian affirm that all the apostolic churches had. Secondly, records of the chain of title and the establishment of the process are independently corroborated in the writings of the fathers. Thirdly, as observed by C.H. Turner, this constituted one of the principal counterarguments against the textual assertions of the Gnostics, who had an opportunity to falsify the claims of the apostolic churches if such statements were false. However, the Gnostics, to judge from the material that has come down to us, did let the case go by default. So far from raising any demurrer against the apostolic Christians or apostolic successions of the church, their line of attack was to circumvent these publicly attested traditions by propounding as rivals to them private successions and secret scriptures of their own. Consequently, the inability of the Gnostics to falsify the preceding assertions of the apostolic churches is, in itself, an argument whose significance cannot be overstated, considering they had the means at that time and place to properly examine the assertions and the documentation. This leads to my concluding point, which is that the threads of evidence predominantly direct us back to the disciples of Jesus and their scribes, identified as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as authors guilty of writing the four Gospels, and no other author. As was the case with Lucretius' work on the nature of things, we have empirical documentation from contemporaries of the apostles that either indirectly quotes, references, or alludes to the Gospels and authorship. The compelling force of the notable allusions in the letters of Polycarp, Ignatius, First Clement, Papias, and even Paul collectively demonstrates evidence of knowledge, possession, and dissemination of the Gospels in Asia Minor, Antioch, Rome, and Greece from known contemporaries of the apostles, who were appointed to oversee the apostles' churches. This provides positive evidence all pointing back to our suspects. All things considered, we can establish a succession of independent testimonies to the Gospels from the time of the apostles through the end of the 4th century. And throughout the ages, this concrete history remained the same up until the 18th century.
You got 2 minutes.
While I assume that Dr. Ehrman may dispute some or all of this evidence, I'd like to emphasize that the statistical probability of the accumulated documentation being incorrect is almost zero. In closing, if we reject the apostolic polity, how do we explain that the 4 Gospels were uniformly received without objection in almost all the independent Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and Coptic apostolic churches, naming Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as definitive authors, unless it does go back to the apostles as Irenaeus, Tertullian, and the apostolic churches said it did? With that, I would like to thank Dr. Ehrman for allowing me to share my thesis with him.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan. And I'm going to bring Dr. Ehrman in. Also, while we're getting his slides ready on the screen here, make sure you are sending questions in. Again, super chats will be primary. They will absolutely be asked. I do have a few I've starred so far. So make sure you're sending those in for either. Make sure you specify this is for Dr. Ehrman, or this is for Jonathan, or this is for either of the panelists. Make sure you put that in there. All right, Dr. Ehrman, you are free to start whenever you will.
Okay, just a second. I need to. There we go. So, all right. Let me begin by just saying that, like Jonathan, I was raised Episcopalian, and was very active in the Episcopal Church for years. And I also want to say that the views that I'm going to be presenting now are not views that I came to when I left the church and when I became an agnostic. The views that I'm going to be presenting are ones that I held when I was still a committed and active Christian. And I don't think that the question we're debating is a question of faith. It's a question of history. You can be a person of faith and not think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and still think that the Gospels are accurate and true, because these Gospels don't claim to be written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so it's not a matter of whether you believe the Bible or not. It's just a question of who actually wrote these books. I'd like to thank Jonathan for a very fine presentation. I very much appreciate his approach. He is trained in law, and he has a legal approach to trying to understand why we should think these Gospels were written by the apostles. I do think, though, and I'm going to be trying to show why trying to take a modern legal procedure to understand a historical issue can be problematic, because the kinds of evidence that one uses in modern situations is not always applicable, for reasons beyond our control, to situations that we're dealing with when it comes to antiquity. So, right, who wrote the Gospels? So I'm going to give some of the basic information before giving my views on it. The basic information to begin with: the Gospels are all anonymous. Jonathan, I don't think, will deny this. The authors do not name themselves. So that means that they're anonymous, which means that calling them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is not at least found in the Gospels themselves. The titles we have were added by later scribes and then later editors. Are there any authorial hints within the Gospels to indicate that they're written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? The answer, again, I think, is absolutely no. So one interesting way to do this for yourself: when you read the Gospel of Matthew, look up how often Matthew is mentioned, and look up when Matthew first meets Jesus, Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, and ask yourself, does this sound like the author is talking about himself? Okay, simple exercise, just do it. The answer is no. We do have early quotations of the Gospels. Jonathan was just alluding to them. We have some quotations of the Gospels, at least of Matthew and Luke, in some of the Apostolic Fathers, who would date from after the New Testament period. They're not contemporary with the writings themselves. usually dated from 100 to 140. There's a group of 10 or 11 authors that we call the Apostolic Fathers. And in some of them, he mentioned Polycarp, for example, or in the Didache, uh, or in Ignatius, we have acknowledgement, we have some quotations, or at least references to Gospels. But the interesting thing is, they don't tell us that they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The first time you have any names attached to the Gospels are in the writings of Papias, who was probably writing around 120 to 130. We don't have his books, unfortunately. He wrote 5 volumes, and we only have quotations by people living later, usually centuries later, who will quote a snippet or two from him. Very interesting quotations. And in one of them, he indicates that Matthew, the disciple of Jesus, collected the sayings of Jesus in Hebrew. He also says that Mark was the companion of Peter, who Peter himself didn't write a gospel, but Mark heard Peter preaching, and so eventually he wrote down the things Peter said. And what Papias says is, he had one major concern: to write down everything that Peter had told him about Jesus. Let me say that can't be true of the Gospel of Mark. Of course, it's not everything that Peter would have said about Jesus. The Gospel of Mark you can read in 2 hours. But if Jesus' ministry lasted 3 years, you got 2 hours of material. So it's certainly not everything. The other thing to say is, when he said that Matthew collected the sayings of Jesus in Hebrew, well, that's not our Gospel of Matthew. Our Gospel of Matthew is written in Greek. And if Jonathan disagrees with that, he and I can talk about that. It was written in Greek, and it's not a collection of the sayings of Jesus. It's about his life, his activities, his deeds, his miracles, his death, his resurrection. There are certainly teachings in it, but this is not what Papias is describing. We don't know whether Papias knew our Matthew or not, but he's not talking about our Matthew. Did he know our Mark or not? We have no way of knowing, because he doesn't quote anything from Mark and then say this is in the Gospel of Mark. He just says that Mark wrote a gospel, and he says Matthew wrote a collection of sayings, or produced a collection of sayings. It's interesting that as time goes on, as far up to the middle of the 2nd century, Justin, who's commonly known as Justin Martyr, even though Martyr is not his last name, it's unfortunately what happened to him. We have 3 books by Justin Martyr in which he quotes Gospels, and he does not name them as Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. He calls them the memoirs of the apostles, but he doesn't tell us which apostles. And he does say that they were Gospels, but oddly, he doesn't name any of them, except one, the Gospel of Peter. What? Well, there is a Gospel of Peter. There's a Gospel of Peter floating around when Justin was writing. And in fact, when Justin talks about Jesus' passion narrative, the death of Jesus, the language he uses about this refers to the Gospel of Peter, the one we have that was not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Okay. Something changed radically around the year 180, 185, right in there. Irenaeus, whom Jonathan mentioned, does tell us for the first time the names of the authors. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He says those are the 4. And we know he's talking about our Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because he quotes them. And then he attributes. So he has the 4, and he calls them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it's the first time. Now, I'm not sure when Jonathan dates the Gospels. He may date them earlier than me, but if so, then it creates even a bigger problem. Along with most critical scholars, I think that the Gospels are written between 70 and 95 or so of the Common Era. Irenaeus is writing about a century later. And it's the first time anyone names them. About the same time, we have a fragment called the Muratorian fragment. It's called that because it's discovered by a guy named Muratori. It's a list of the books that this unknown author and unnamed author thought were in scriptures. Unfortunately, it's a fragment because we don't have the beginning of it. And it begins right in the middle of a sentence by saying something about some gospel, but then it says, and the 3rd of the gospels was Luke, and the 4th was John. So we assume that he had Matthew and Mark as well. So that's about the same time as Irenaeus. What does this show us? By 185, toward the end of the 2nd century, people are calling these things Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. At least these 2 authors are, both of whom, by the way, were closely connected with Rome. The Muratorian fragment appears to have been written in Rome about then, and Irenaeus spent a lot of time getting his education in Rome before he became the Bishop of Gaul. Okay, so in Rome, around 185, boom, there it is. So we have them, and after that, they're basically called that. When you have gospel titles in our manuscripts, like when you have ancient manuscripts of the Gospels, there are titles, and they have our titles. They start appearing in the 3rd century, so the titles start appearing after Irenaeus and the Muratorian fragment, and they have the same names attached. The thing about the titles in the Gospels, though, as I said, they're actually not titles given by the authors themselves. One way to know that is that the titles in the manuscripts are according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. When I write a book and I put a title on it, I don't call it according to Bart. Oh, so some of my critics say I should call it that because it's just like my opinion about things. But when you call something according to, you're saying whose version of the gospel is this? And so the fuller name is the Gospel according to Matthew. Matthew doesn't call his book the Gospel according to Matthew. That's somebody later telling you whose version of the gospel this is. Same with Mark, Luke, and John. This is not a title. We don't have ancient books that are entitled according to. So those are later attributions based on the common view that they're written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And those are unanimous attributions, as Jonathan pointed out. I mean, I think most of Jonathan's point was that they're always called that. If they're always called that, that's probably what they are. But I want to consider whether those attributions are the best guesses of people living later, starting in the end of the 2nd century, or are they false attributions where they actually weren't written by these people, or are they right? Were they written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Okay, so I want to, we could talk a long time about this. We could have a 12-hour debate on this very issue, but I'm going to cut to the chase with what I think is the most important consideration of all. Who were Jesus' disciples and his followers in the early years? We know from the New Testament itself, Jesus' own disciples, including Matthew and John, were Aramaic-speaking, uneducated day laborers from rural Galilee. Galilee is the northern part of what we think of as Israel. The followers of Jesus were described, the ones who have any description of them in the Gospels, is that they were day laborers, such as fishermen and such. They were uneducated. I'm going to try and show that. But the New Testament actually says that Peter and John were illiterate. Acts chapter 4, verse 13, which I'll talk about in a minute. And they were certainly uneducated, for reasons I'll show, if they were day laborers in rural Galilee, and they were absolutely Aramaic speakers. Could they have spoken Greek? Yeah, probably not. But if they did, in these rural areas, there was not a lot of education going on, and not a lot of bilingualism, as we know from modern research and archaeological discoveries in Galilee. People there basically spoke Aramaic, especially if they were lower class day laborers, which Jesus was, and so were these people. All right. Well, so if Jonathan wants to discuss that, we're absolutely fine. I'm absolutely fine to discuss that because there's a lot to be said about it and evidence that I think is completely overwhelming for all of that. And the Gospels basically say as much. They do say it. So, all right, if those are Jesus' disciples, who wrote the Gospels? Were they Aramaic, uneducated day laborers from rural Galilee? No, they weren't. Whoever wrote these Gospels were Greek-speaking people who were highly educated, who were trained authors from Greek-speaking realms outside of Israel. So, is that a match? Yeah, no, not really. But let me go into that. Whoever wrote these books had to be highly educated in Greek. So those of us who read and study and teach Greek realize that it's a difficult language to learn if you are an English-speaking person, like most of us. And it was difficult in the ancient world to learn it as a second language. People could often learn how to speak it sometimes, but being able to speak a language ain't the same thing as being able to write it. I have undergraduate students who are, say, seniors at university, at a very fine university, who get straight A's and who are some of my best students, who could not write a book as good as the Gospel of John. Absolutely couldn't come close. In English. In English. These people are highly educated, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So they're educated in Greek. So what do we know about Greek education in antiquity? And is it the kind of thing that the disciples of Jesus would have had? So first thing I want to point out are the demographics of the ancient world. The overwhelming population in the time of Jesus throughout the Roman Empire was rural. 80 to 90% of people lived in rural area, in small villages and hamlets off in the countryside. Wealth distribution. We know most about wealth within urban settings in the big cities. There were basically two cities in Galilee, Sepphoris and Tiberias. Jerusalem was a city. Most people didn't live in these places. Most of the wealth was located throughout the empire, in the cities, in urban areas. Even within the cities, 55, these are statistics that I can back up, and I'd show you where to look them up because this is done by people who've studied ancient demographics for decades. 55 to 60% of the urban population at the time was at or below subsistence level. In other words, they were barely getting by. I don't mean they had only one car, and only one TV set. And I don't mean that they had to have a black and white TV. I mean these are people who are barely able to feed themselves, or not so much. 10 to 20% are absolutely destitute, starving. So somewhere between 65 and 80% of the population in the urban centers were in very bad shape economically, much worse than today. As bad as hunger issues are today, far worse in the ancient world. And in the rural areas, it was worse because the wealth was located in the cities. It was very much a hand-to-mouth existence for people who lived in the rural world, meaning 80 to 90% of the world. Who got Greek education and what was it like? Well, the Greek education came to those who were wealthy and urban and elite children. This is documented repeatedly throughout our sources and in modern scholarship. The only people to get formal education were wealthy, urban, elite children, except with one exception, which is that slaves who served wealthy, urban, elite people could sometimes be educated so they could help out with the household duties. There were three stages of Greek education. To start off, they didn't teach reading and writing at the same time in ancient Greece or throughout the Roman Empire. You spent several years just learning how to read letters and copy letters, where you would first learn the alphabet, then you learn the syllables, then you learn to read words, then you learn to read phrases. You learn how to copy your name. That would take 3 years or so. Then came grammar. The grammar education is for people who had mastered the ability to copy letters and to do a little bit of reading. This is where you learn elite reading, where you actually read the classics and talked about what they meant, and you learned how grammar worked, and you learned how to write a personal letter. That took more years for children. After that, some students, not very many, moved into the third stage, which is rhetoric and composition. This is where you learn how to write something out of your own mind. How you came up with something to write and wrote it. That took many years. The whole thing was years long, many years. And it always started with children. That's to get educated at the level of our authors. And even those who learn rhetoric and composition, only few of those can learn to compose. Compose like, narratives. Okay. So, do we have any evidence of this kind of thing in rural Galilee, this kind of Greek education? No. Do we have any evidence of people being trained in a second language this way? You've grown up speaking Arabic and then you go and then you learn the second language, this kind of education? No. Why? Because Is there any adult education in the ancient world, in the Greek and Roman worlds? No. They don't have evening classes at the local school. No. Okay. So who could read and write? Generally, and where Jesus lived. Generally. Common assumptions. People just commonly assume most people can read and write, right? Most of us can read and write. It turns out that widespread literacy is a development that happened mainly starting in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. Because as you start getting factories and things, it turns out that if you spend a lot of money educating a lot of people, they'll be better workers. So it comes with the Industrial Revolution. You don't have it in the ancient world. One of the classic studies of this is by William Harris, who teaches at Columbia University in New York, who wrote a book called Ancient Literacy. Harris did a full analysis of what we know about Greek and Roman literacy, and he concluded, based on a full book-length analysis that you can read, it's worth reading, that 10 to 15% of the population was literate at the best of times and places, like Athens in the 5th century BCE. Who were these 10 to 15%? They were the wealthy, elite urbanites. What about in Israel? How many people could read and write there? Once again, common assumptions. We all heard that every Jewish boy went to synagogue school and learned how to read and write. Wrong. It's not true. We do have sources that say that hundreds of years after the days of Jesus, but not in the days of Jesus. Here, the book to turn to, if you're interested in these things, Literacy in Roman Palestine by Catherine Hetzer, a prominent scholar of ancient Jewish life, especially in Israel. Okay, Catherine Hetzer comes up with a startling conclusion. At the time of Jesus in Roman Palestine, maybe 3% or so, maybe a little bit more, between 3 and 4, but closer to 3% of the population could read. Almost entirely, those who were taught to read were taught only to read the Hebrew Bible, the Torah. They weren't taught to read other things, let alone other languages. Far fewer than this could actually write something, and far fewer of those who could write, that is like copy a sentence, far fewer of those could compose. The ones who could compose, again, in Israel were the wealthy elite urbanites. As it turns out, from the entire 1st century, the only 2 authors that we know who produced literary works in Israel at the time, the century of Jesus, 2 people, the historian Josephus, whose writings we have, and his enemy, Justin of Tiberias, whose writings we don't have. They're the only 2 known authors that we have. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, and John, and Mark are said to have been from Israel at the time.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Then I'll hit my conclusion. My conclusion is that Jesus' disciples simply would not have been able to compose extensive Greek narratives. They didn't have the training for it. Why then were these books attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Because at the end of the 2nd century, starting in the middle of the 2nd century, as Jonathan pointed out, there are other named gospels. We have lots of other gospels from the time that we know about. The Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Secret John, the Gospel of Basilides, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Hebrews. These are all competing for attention among Christians. How are the people who subscribe to the authority of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John supposed to show that they are authoritative? By giving them authorial names, authors who are authoritative. It's no accident that this happens when all these other gospels are floating around. They needed authority, and they had 2 natural choices. They chose 2 of Jesus' disciples, Matthew and John. And then they chose 2 companions of his 2 most important apostles, Peter and Paul. Mark, the companion of Peter, Luke, the companion of Paul. It's not an accident they chose those 4. I don't think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John themselves wrote these books.
All right. Outstanding, gentlemen. Thank you so much for those presentations. Now we're going to go into the rebuttals. I'm going to bring Jonathan back on the stage. Gentlemen, thank you so much. You'll have 10 minutes. Again, I'll give that extended 2 minutes if we need to do that for the rebuttals. Jonathan, you're going to go first, and I will start your time the minute you start speaking.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ehrman, for your presentation, your thesis. I think you made a lot of really good points. To kind of clarify a couple questions leading into our Q&A period. Obviously, I believe Matthew was translated in both Aramaic and Greek. While I probably lean on it was done in Greek, I do believe that there was probably a need very early on, since Antioch was half Syrian. We have evidence from Eusebius that Christianity reached Edessa very early. So there would have been a need for an Aramaic version, especially in Jerusalem as well. Even though I do believe Greek may have come first, but I think as in part of authorship, we could go to the Syriac churches. They have what they believe, and their tradition is the first Aramaic Matthew. But the next thing I sort of want to talk about real quick is you did bring up Papias. So I think it's important to note a couple of things. And as you rightly point out, that yes, Papias, the bishop in Asia Minor, does definitely name Mark and identifies him as an author of a gospel, but we don't know if he's referring to our gospel of Mark, which I think is a fair reading of the text. Now, it did get me thinking, the same could be said for Cicero's reference to the poems of Lucretius. He doesn't actually quote from the nature of things, but I think what we need to understand, what Augustine argues, is that statements such as these are evidence that the authors brought their works into the public domain. And from this point, while we have Papias's information, we need to follow the threads of evidence. And initially, if we go to John's foster churches in Asia Minor, where Papias is from, and then we look at Peter's churches. So if we know of some sort of alluded work to Peter, and we go to Peter's churches in Antioch and Rome, then Mark's in Alexandria and Paul's in Greece, the documentary evidence would, for the most part, point back to the Mark that we all know. And because we know where Papias is from, we know the church that he was assigned administrator of, we can get that information. And I would say this goes back to Papias' statement on Matthew as well. And while I agree that the statement may be vague, and I'll kind of explain some of that later on, we could still follow that same statement. And we don't have to take Papias' statement on his own. We have Clement of Alexandria, we have Eusebius, we have Papias that Irenaeus says that he was aware of, and he was familiar with those statements. So when we compare Papias's statements along with Clement of Alexandria with Irenaeus on this question of Mark and Matthew about them bringing works into the public domain, all these writers that are overseeing the churches they point to that same Matthew and Mark. So the question is, what other, well, obviously I know there's other versions of things out there, but these are the ones representing the churches that he would have had access to, that all the churches in Asia Minor represent. So wouldn't that be the natural logical conclusion? Just like with Lucretius, what other work on the nature of thing are all these later writings referring to, if it's not what Cicero's referring at his particular time? So that's my point on some of Papias' statement. I think the next thing I do want to bring up, because you did advocate that Jesus' disciples didn't speak Greek. I understand your reference back to Acts, I believe it's 4:13, to the illiterate. Now, as you may aware, I know J.N. Sevenster, who writes, Do you know Greek? Could the apostles have, and Jesus' disciples explained it? I know Dr. Scott Gleaves, along with Stanley Porter and Paul Barnett, advocates for the thesis that they certainly could have known it very well, and they do advocate that particular thesis. I know we see in the text itself of the Gospels, instances, and I know Jane Stevenson points this out, conversations between, Pilate and Jesus. There's no indication in the text that there was a need for an interpreter. Jesus and his disciples are preaching all over the area, and there's a number of uh, 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 areas that were Hellenized over for the last 350 years. So he's obviously going out to a lot of communities where they spoke Greek. And once again, there's no indication in the text of the Gospels itself that they couldn't speak Greek. And I think I know you did bring up about Josephus, referring that slaves were had the ability to learn Greek as well. But once again, I think we do have. I know it's a debatable topic. We have J.N. Sevenster, who writes thoroughly on this question, advocating for a different a position that they did know. I think the other thing that we got to consider, Dr. Ehrman, is in the writings of Paul, we see in the works of Peter, that they did use secretaries. And we kind of see this clearly in Romans. We see this in 1 Peter. So while maybe they couldn't speak, they did have access to those that did know Greek. So that's another thing that we have to consider. And the fact that Paul had Luke, we know Mark had, or Peter had Mark, John was over in Ephesus. Great. He probably had a whole host of great scribes over there that can compose his work. So I think those are some of the things that we got to take into consideration on this. The other question I have, or point that I want to bring up, while you do state that they were highly educated Greeks, now one of the things I'll probably follow up with you on is that the highly educated Greeks, I think from my understanding, is wouldn't they have written in Attica, areas around Athens or Iona or Alexandrian Greek? But the New Testament Gospels are in the Koine Greek with smatterings of Aramaic, which would go to the language of trade. So why don't we see, the Gospels in Alexandrian or Ionic or Attic Greek? Why do we see it in the language of trade, the Koine, with smatterings of Aramaic? So that's another point that I want to go to. I think the next thing that I wanted to talk about, and I think this is a good question. The Gospels in the text do not name themselves. They don't. And I think there's a couple of really good reasons. And I'll kind of just specify this is, from my perspective, I think we don't have a lot of history on why they didn't attach their particular names. I would say that we do have to understand that Jesus was charged with treason against Rome for claiming to be God and King, as all the Gospels allege. And, Matthew, Peter, and John were Galileans. They weren't a Roman citizen like Paul, who had all these additional rights that he does appeal to in his writings, that Peter and John would not have access to. We have to take into consideration that Christians weren't granted legal status until the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. We know from Livy that foreign religious ceremonies against the state or religion of Rome was deemed unlawful. And this is why we see in Pliny's letter, that Christians were meeting secretly in their homes, because obviously they can't go out to the temples. So they are keeping a very low profile. We even see this in Justin in his martyrdom. The governor is asking him specifically, where are you guys hanging out? What do you guys believe in? So they were actively searching for these individuals. So I think one of the things is, why would they actually add their name? They're going to be connected with an individual that was charged with treason against the throne. I think one of the things that we see in the Gospels is that the Pharisees and the Sadducees, during his trial and crucifixion, it's like, hey, here's your king of the Jews, and the Pharisees are very quick to say, no, we have no king but Caesar. So obviously being connected with Jesus, someone who's accused against the throne for claiming to be king, would probably not be ideal to throw your name on a document where they come and look for you, because you shouldn't even be assembling together. I think that's probably, I'll kind of wrap up here in the next 30 seconds, but I think that's one of the reasons. I think the second thing is what we see in a lot of the Jewish writings, the Torah, obviously attributed to Moses, which I believe. Obviously, these works that we see in the Old Testament, a lot of them dealing with Chronicles, Kings. Yeah, the author doesn't assign their name, and we see in a lot of these Jewish works, and hopefully, Dr. Ehrman, you would agree that these works are meant for the people, in the same way that the last will and testament of Jesus Christ is meant for the congregations. They're not like the Greeks, where they're trying to create a name for themselves or be a sense of pride. This is all about the people of the church. So I think from a humility standpoint and keeping a low profile is why we don't see them actually name themselves in the text. However, last point I want to make on that, names can be forged. And as you're aware of a lot of the documents in the ancient world, putting a name on it doesn't guarantee it is who they say it's from. And with that, I will close.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan, for that rebuttal. Dr. Ehrman, you will also have the same allotted time, 10 minutes plus. And I will start the time as soon as you give your first statements.
Okay, I'll start off. Thanks, Jonathan. Very interesting. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about Jonathan's main points in his talk for my rebuttal, but I do want to say that with respect to his rebuttal just now, I think a couple of his points are very good points, don't really rebut my case. I'm not asking really why they publish things anonymously. We could talk about that. There are various reasons one could come up with it, but it doesn't have any bearing on the question whether they were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I would disagree about the Koine. These are written in Koine Greek, but so is most literature at the time. And so we have very fine, high-level authors, Lucian of Samosata, who are literary figures who write in Koine Greek, and so that really wouldn't, that doesn't have much of an effect on anything. The other thing I'll say is I'm not sure that Jonathan actually dealt directly with my main arguments. My question is, how do Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John get the education that they had to have, given what we know about the educational system? And so maybe Jonathan can talk about that later, maybe in the Q&A, but where did the education come and how do they have this level of literacy? I am not asking, look, I did say, I don't think they knew Greek, but just leave that alone. I'm not just asking whether they knew Greek. I'm asking, could they write books like this? Could a fisherman in Galilee write like this? Do we have any evidence of anyone like that writing like this in the period? Do we have any evidence of anybody in Israel up in rural Galilee being able to write like this? No. So what makes us think they did? Well, Jonathan's main argument is that we have an unbroken chain of evidence. This works well in legal cases. You got a lot of eyewitnesses. Good, that's good. And it's unbroken. And this person, that person, that person. And he points out that Augustine said, well, that's how it was with Plato, so we know that Plato wrote these things, except we have books attributed to Plato that were not written by Plato. So Augustine was wrong about that. The big problem, though, is that his key example is Lucretius and Cicero. Lucretius writes on the nature of things, and Jonathan points out that Cicero considered whether he did it or not, and he showed that he did write it. And ever since then, everybody's agreed he wrote it. But Lucretius and Cicero were contemporaries. They lived at the same time. We're not talking about a chain of witnesses for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that start when these books were published. The witnesses don't start appearing for 100 years. Then they're uniform. And so, yes, you can list Irenaeus and Tertullian and Eusebius and Athanasius and Jerome, and you can go through the list. Absolutely. As I said myself, it's a uniform list, but it doesn't start in their day. So it's not an unbroken chain. And of course, they live in different places. And so, yes, that's good too. But, my question is, why isn't it? This is another point he hasn't addressed. Why aren't they identified as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John until the end of the 2nd century, 100 years later? And it's really not right to say that Irenaeus, Tertullian, Eusebius, Athanasius, Jerome, et cetera, Augustine are independent witnesses to these titles. Of course, they're not independent witnesses. Eusebius quotes Irenaeus all over the place. Athanasius knew these authors. Jerome knows these authors. They're reading each other at later times. And so, yes, it's a continuous stream once it starts. Jonathan assumes that if you've got unanimous testimony whenever it starts, that therefore that indicates that the person really wrote what it is the person is said to have written. That's just not true in the ancient world, as I imagine he knows. I mean, for example, we have a group of poems called the Homeric hymns, hymns to various ones of the gods, attributed to Homer. For as long as they go back, they were not written by Homer. There's no debate about that these days. Aesop's fables, they don't all go back to Aesop. No debate about that. The writings of Hippocrates, many of them don't go back to Hippocrates, but they have been identified as going back to these authors from the very beginning. You have that in Christian circles. How do you explain the Epistle of Barnabas always being called the Epistle of Barnabas, even though it was written 60 years after Barnabas was dead? Or Second Clement, written a century after Clement, but always called Clement, down to the modern period. The Exhortations to the Greeks, attributed to Justin Martyr. Well, he didn't write it, but it's attributed to him. So you get this in pagan circles, Roman circles, Greek circles, in Christian circles, in Jewish circles. It was unanimously thought in the early church that the Apocalypse of Peter, the first several centuries, is thought the Apocalypse of Peter was written by Peter. It wasn't written by Peter. Nobody thinks it was written by Peter. This happens in the modern world too. By the way, we have a book that everybody calls the Secret Gospel of Mark. Everybody calls it that. They've called it that since 1973 when Morton Smith published it. And the text that he's talking about doesn't have a title on it. He called it the Secret Gospel of Mark. And everybody calls it the Secret Gospel of Mark. Why do they all call it the Secret Gospel of Mark? Because the first person who put a name to it called it that. And everybody afterward did the same thing. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were anonymous. They were written anonymously, as Jonathan agrees. They were passed on anonymously. They're quoted without being named for 100 years. But once somebody puts a name on them, apparently somebody in Rome, which at this time is becoming the biggest church and the most influential church in the empire, somebody puts a name on these things, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and everybody else afterwards calls them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So what else are they going to call them? That's what people are starting to call them. That's what happens in the modern world. It's what happened in the medieval world. It's what happened in the ancient world, in Greece and Rome. It's what happened in the Christian world. And so the fact that you have continuous representation starting 100 years later is not evidence that, in fact, that they originally were called this, or that they were originally thought to be by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if they were thought to be written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you would expect that the people who quote them would assign those authors to them because those authors provide the authority they need. So that's my basic line. I don't think that he's actually refuted the case that I'm making, and I think that his case would work very well if we did have a continuous line going back to the authors themselves of the attribution of the authorship, but it's precisely what we don't have.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate those rebuttals. And it looks like you guys can go a lot of the ways here. So we're going to start with that. Just a reminder to those in the audience, I've been starring numerous questions that have come in. I've had some outside of YouTube that have come in. Some have given donations on the side. So I'll make sure to ask those just off reading them. That won't be on the screen. The others, I will bring yours onto the screen. Again, please, if you're going to send a question, put @facts or Q something, let me know. not cue the document, cue the question, and we'll make sure we get in here and ask those exactly as they come into each person you intended them for. If it's for both, please say this is for both panelists, and we'll go from there. All right, we are now going to enter the cross-examination. There'll be 2 total sections of this, between Jonathan starting and Dr. Ehrman responding, and then we'll do another round of that. Make sure, gentlemen, our questions are clear, and we'll try to get as many of these in as possible on the answers as well. Jonathan, whenever you are ready, it is your floor to give.
Okay, thank you. And just like to let everyone know, and Dr. and Bart Ehrman as well, I am Northern Italian, so sometimes I talk a little too much. So I'll try to keep it short here. But I think on one of my first questions, Bart, is if the church's testimony on the gospel authors is some sort of result of either collusion, or as you kind of mentioned in your rebuttal, that they were simply following the tradition of a prominent see like Rome, which did have some influence, then why don't we have any sort of historical documentation of such activity? So similar to what we had in the dispute over the Passover. Obviously, the bishops in Asia, did not follow the tradition of Rome and some of the other major sees in the West. But we have a lot of documentation about these disputes, where they agreed, where they didn't agree. Why don't we see any of that with them sort of following and say, hey, we're going to jump on board. This is the talking points that we're going to have for these gospels going forward.
Yeah, good question. Thanks. I'm not sure what you mean by collusion, because that has kind of a derogatory connotation to me. So I'm not quite sure. I don't think that.
Or they sort of got together. Where did they get together to kind of decide? So maybe that's a better term instead of collusion.
Yeah. Well, I think it's sometime somewhere in Rome, probably around the end of the 2nd century. Why don't we have any historical documentation as we do for, say, the Quartodeciman controversy? Well, this isn't a controversy. I mean, there were not debates the way there are about like when to have Easter. And so that's one point, is that, it's not the same thing. But the other thing is the question could be turned back to you as well, because if you think that they were called this immediately upon publication, well, what's our documentation of that? Why isn't that documented? Eusebius, who's a church historian, or like, why? So we don't have historical documentation for when people started calling the Epistle Barnabas, or when they started calling the Homeric hymns. And so it's very common to have anonymous writings that are attributed. Somebody finally makes an attribution and they're simply accepted. And in almost, I don't know of any case, the writings of Hippocrates or the Aesop's fables, or any case in Greek, Roman, Jewish, or Christian literature that where you have documentation.
So, and just kind of follow-up question. So let's talk about the Syriac churches. Given that the earliest versions of the Peshitta don't contain a number of records that not only, when we look at Jude and Revelation, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, would you see the Syriac church and some of these other churches following Rome? Because obviously they supported the Epistle to the Hebrews in their text. They supported James, whereas Rome disputed Hebrews. So do we, when we see this dynamic in the churches of them not following each other, especially on authorship and canon? I mean, I know Rome kind of disputed Hebrews. They only had a small following. The Greeks and the Syriac churches held their own. So what is your thoughts around why they would have all sort of like, yes, let's go with these, but all the other ones that did have big names on them, they didn't follow each other? There's great dissension among the Syriac Greek and the Western churches.
Well, I think the Syriac Church is not accepting the Catholic epistles is not the same as whether they accepted the names that were attached to them. And so I, we don't have disputes about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'm not saying, though, that Rome passed a decree or something and that Syria decided to, disallow it. There wasn't a decree. And it doesn't have to be Rome. I'm just guessing Rome because the Muratorian fragment's probably from there. And Irenaeus was there for a good time before he went off to Gaul. And so the commonality is Rome, but it doesn't have to be Rome. It would kind of make sense it was. But I'm not saying that this was like some kind of like doctrine that was being enforced on anybody. I'm saying that somebody finally had to attribute these things. They called them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's no reason to say something else. And so it's just like today when you have when something described in a certain way that other people describe it that way because there's no reason to describe it otherwise. And again, it's like the Epistle of Barnabas or First Clement or Second Clement or why call them that? Why not call them that? That's what people you've heard somebody call them. Okay, that's what it is then. And so I'm not saying that it's Rome exercising its authority in some way.
Okay. So I know I spent some time in my opening going over, and I do want to clarify, obviously, the ancient Augustine, Tertullian were obviously not arguing their legal stance in a modern context. There's all these other applications. But I think what's interesting about Tertullian and Irenaeus making the sort of natural custody, that these records are found among the apostles' estate. We do have documents from Clement of Alexandria, that Basilides, we have Valentius. They made similar claims of, hey, we were associated with the apostles, so listen to us. I think in the Ptolemy's letter to, I think we have in Ephesus, he makes a claim at the end that, they're following the succession of the apostles. So one of the things that I want to bring up is, when we're dealing with the apostles are not alive anymore, they're making this claim to say, hey, these are the deeds and wills, the last will and testament of the apostles. They are the basis for our teachings. The Gnostics, you don't have rights to them. Tertullian and Irenaeus do make a good case that these records are found among the apostles' churches. And while I tried to at least emphasize that the court's opinions on this matter, while it's only to get it introduced into evidence, is that would eliminate the notion of fraud. From a historian perspective, why would you say that records found among the apostles' churches, while they're making claims, why would that not be a good benchmark to say, hey, it does lend to a degree of certainty there?
Yeah, well, if we had those documents, it would be very interesting, but unfortunately we don't. I don't know how well versed our listeners are in the writings of Tertullian and the kinds of claims he makes, but he certainly makes lots of claims that, so far as I know, nobody thinks can be right, including, for example, that Pontius Pilate, that there were accounts of Pontius Pilate, that Pilate wrote letters and things. We have letters of Pontius Pilate, by the way, that have always been called the same thing, even though Pilate didn't write them. And so I don't think that, when you have church fathers who are attesting things, saying, oh yeah, but we have records. It's kind of like when you read apocryphal works like the Acts of Paul, which begins with an account of how this author, who's writing a legendary account of what Paul said and did, not found in the New Testament, how he discovered this document in the basement of the house that Paul used to live in, and lo and behold, here we have an account of Paul's, and it goes on to describe things, a discovery thing. Discovery narratives are very common, but they're never credible. not just in Christian circles, but you get these things in Greek and Roman circles as well. So the fact that Tertullian says that there are records, he doesn't produce them, he doesn't quote them, and we have no other evidence of them, and so he may have heard that there were. But people hear all sorts of things that aren't historically correct.
All right, Jonathan, you'll have time for one more question before Dr. Ehrman can question you. You should be able to get one more, and Dr. Ehrman will have time to respond to it.
Okay. No, that should sound good. I guess let me follow up on the Papias question. And I do agree with you in the sense that obviously Papias actually names a work that may be out there attributed that Mark wrote at the dictation of Peter. While, yes, I kind of understand that as there's a work out there, but to connect the evidence, do we look at the churches where he's from and see what that points back to? Because if we go to Asia Minor, now obviously Irenaeus, who is not only a witness to, he was educated in Rome, but he spent a lot of time in Asia Minor as well under what he claims to be Bishop Polycarp in Smyrna. So he's obviously a witness to the tradition that has come down in Asia Minor. And when we look at the Mark that's being referenced, and we have Tertullian and Irenaeus all coming back to that same Mark, what would you say is the evidentiary value of that assessment? That, does it point back to what he's saying? And would this be the natural conclusion that we should follow?
Well, I don't see a lot connecting Peter and Mark to Asia Minor. Peter was a missionary to Jews, and the Asia Minor churches, as according to Paul in Galatians 2, and the Asia Minor churches were Gentile, so far as we know, and we don't have records of Peter wandering around there. We do have the book of First Peter that's addressed to Asian churches in Asia Minor, but that doesn't indicate that he's been there. Mark, I'm not quite sure how we're getting the connection of Mark to Asia Minor. The tradition is that Mark went to Alexandria and became the bishop of Alexandria, Egypt.
I think just to kind of restate, Papias is from Asia Minor, so he would obviously it'd be a book that he'd be familiar with. Obviously,
why is it being in Asia Minor make him familiar with this book?
Well, because if he's calling out, books that he's aware of, are these books circulating in the current area? And we know at least by the end of the 2nd century,
he knows of a book called Mark. And I'm questioning whether it's the Mark that we have.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you for the good charitable responses and questions. Dr. Ehrman, you can now turn that and aim it right back at him.
Oh, yes.
All right, here we go. My turn. Yeah, all right,
Yes.
good. Okay. Okay, so Jonathan, you said that we have contemporaries to the apostles that know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You mentioned several people, Paul, Polycarp, and others. Do we have any contemporaries that actually name them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
No. So we don't.
Our question is who wrote them. I mean, and the question is, do these contemporaries indicate who wrote them?
No. The only thing we do have is the churches of Rome, Antioch. Those are all 1st century witnesses.
Oh no, but they don't. What witnesses from 1st century Rome or Antioch call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
No, we don't have any testimony from that particular time.
No, it's later. Yeah. Okay. You said that maybe these authors, if they didn't get a Greek education, maybe they could have used secretaries.
Yes.
Can you say something about what we know about secretaries in antiquity?
No, and obviously it's not my field of expertise. What I would say, I know J.N. Stevenson points this out, but the use of secretaries for Paul, we see it in Peter's writings, that the availability to use secretaries are at least indicated in their work.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul definitely dictated his letters, at least some of them. One of the secretaries identifies himself, Tertius, names himself, says, "I, Tertius, who writing this letter, greet you," in the book of Romans. And so it means that he's copying Paul's letters. So, I mean, the fullest study of secretaries is done by Randy Richards, who's I think he's probably an evangelical. he wrote a book on secretaries in the ancient world. He looked up every reference he could find to secretaries in Plutarch and in Cicero and Suetonius, and he looked at every surviving letter we have from Egypt that survived, from the Oxyrhynchus finds, and he looked through every one of them to find out what secretaries did. He could not find a single instance in which a secretary co-wrote or co-authored or authored on the basis of what somebody told him, who composed something for someone else. And so when we say that, maybe Mark was the secretary for Peter and he like he wrote down Peter's thing, I don't know of a single instance of that being that documented as happening anywhere in the ancient world. So Richard wrote that, I don't know, some years ago now, but I don't know of anything that's turned up since then. So I'm just asking, are we kind of thinking like secretaries today who might do that kind of thing?
No, I think, so if we look at the documentation we have, whether it's true or not, coming out of Alexandria, with Clement, from Eusebius, Irenaeus, they do identify that there was, Luke and Mark that were assigned to writing these Gospels. And I think, when we look at some of the documentation, there was a need. I think from Justin, Hippolytus, we have the heretical person Simon Magnus that came in on scene. I think Eusebius kind of dates, Peter's, visit to coincide with Simon Magnus. And, at that time, we're getting history of, hey, Mark, you need to compile this information, because obviously the apostolic churches would want to control the narrative. And how do you do that? You get this writing out there. So your propaganda holds suit in this.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good way to put it, because certainly Clement and Eusebius are trying to control the narrative. So Clement of Alexandria is from around the year 200. Eusebius is about 100 years after that. We're talking about authors who wrote books 120, 220, either 120 or 220 years before that. And so for your legal analysis, which you're the expert on, it seems to me that if you've got somebody today who is who testifies about who committed a murder in the year 1900, and this is the first time that the culprit's been named, 120 years later, that it seems to me in a court of law that probably wouldn't hold. That it's nice to have an eyewitness. It's nice to have contemporary evidence. But if you don't have contemporary evidence and you don't have an eyewitness, if somebody 120 years later says it doesn't seem like that would hold up in a court of law. Do you think?
No, it'd be tough unless I know they found someone recently from 40 years ago
but 40 years ago, are you going to take testimony from somebody 40 years ago?
No, but I think what I was trying to apply in the opening, and Tertullian obviously advocates this point, whether he's right or wrong, and he's obviously going from his agenda, is that when we're dealing with documents, and church documents are covered under the ancient document exception, is we have a situation where, you would agree that the documents eventually show up, and if they're by the end of the 2nd century, the question is they do show up in the estate or the churches that the apostles themselves set up and organized.
Oh, I'm not sure that's true, actually.
No, and
I'm not sure.
Well, I would say.
What churches do we know that Peter established?
Antioch.
Well, how do we know Peter established the church in Antioch?
Well, we would
it's on
agree.
The New Testament.
Yeah, so if we look at Rome, so we have churches of Rome.
Who established the church? Who established the church in Rome?
Well, we have documentation from Eusebius. We have Jerome that he set up the church at
Peter
Antioch.
did? Mm-hmm. Yeah, but Jerome, these people are living 300 years later.
Yeah, and
What evidence do we have from the time? So there's a church in Antioch already by the time Paul writes the letters to the Galatians. Paul didn't establish it. He doesn't say Peter established it. So what? I mean, what? Rome. Our first evidence for the city of Rome is Paul's letter to the Romans, where he names over 25 people by name that he knows there, and Peter's not one of them. Doesn't look like Peter had even been there, and Paul himself hadn't been there, as he says. So how do we know that the apostles established those churches?
Well, and so this would go to the other part. Someone had to establish. They are in existence. We know that Christianity reached Rome. So obviously it reached Rome somewhere very early in all these churches. Obviously, Paul's writing to all these churches. And, the point that Eusebius, Jerome, Tertullian, Irenaeus is that they have registers that go back. And I think
they say they have. Tertullian says he does, but you're a lawyer. You look for evidence. When somebody testifies something, you ask, what is the evidence? So what's the evidence that Tertullian had some records? He doesn't actually say he has them. He says he's heard that these churches have them.
Well, I know in Prescription Against the Heretics, he describes the process. So the process that we see in Tertullian is the same that Irenaeus is doing. And obviously, as administrators within the church, they can speak on any processes or procedures that were in there to secure writing. So I think even though they're late, they can talk about the process that exists at their time in the churches. Tertullian.
Now, say, Dr. Ehrman, we have time for one more question. Jonathan, if you can finish your statement. I'll extend this one because this is a good one here. So, Jonathan, you can finish that. Dr. Ehrman, we'll give you another question on that one.
So I know I kind of showed in my opening presentation these chain of titles. I know Eusebius produces them in his histories. He produces them for Antioch, which identifies Peter as the head of that church. I know he provides it for Rome. Jerusalem, he provides a list, even though the church was destroyed after the Bar Kokhba War. And they also provide it for Alexandria. But they all say these records are in existence. And you could go to these churches today and they still have these records. So we have all these independent, or all these churches that are at least attributed to other apostles. I mean, because otherwise, where did they come from if it wasn't this movement of Christianity? I mean, obviously, Peter, Paul, you set up your churches, you have your documents, and you propagate your narrative and control it in the groups.
Okay. So, yeah, our information about the founding of the churches mainly come from later legendary records. I mean, the idea that Thomas founded the church in India, for example, comes from the Acts of Thomas, which is, again, 150 years later. And so I'm not sure that really gets us very far. So I don't think I've got any more questions at this point. We can move on.
All right. So that's phase one of the cross-examination. Congratulations, gentlemen. You're 50% there. All right. We're going to flip it right back around. And Jonathan, you can ask any questions you want. I'll start your time as soon as you go through your question.
Okay. So I have a question for you on the Episcopal list, just to kind of understand. I know we have the Librarian Catalog. We have what Jerome put in his Chronicle. We also have, Eusebius's documentation. I believe there's a list that Eusebius quotes from Hegesippus. Ephanetus, I think, produces a list. And so we do have them from different sources. I think there are some minor discrepancies between them. Now, obviously, this is a case that was made at the end of the 2nd century in response to a lot of the claims by Basilides, by Marcion, Valentius, that, hey, they have ties to the apostles. So it's only natural that if you're heirs, or you believe you're heirs to the apostle, you're going to kind of raise up and say, no, we're the true heirs. And we have documentation. I know I brought it up in the opening. What's your thought on, we don't really have an official response from the Gnostics that says, oh man, we can challenge these claims. They kind of let it go by default. So how do we weigh that in our analysis?
So the person you quoted on that was C.H. Turner,
Correct.
who I believe was writing before we knew much about the Nag Hammadi library. The Nag Hammadi library, I think, was discovered in 1945, and that was before Turner was writing. But I don't think the library wasn't available yet, so he didn't know about the Gnostic writings found at Nag Hammadi. Before Nag Hammadi, our only for people to know, the Nag Hammadi library is a collection of Gnostic writings that give us our most information about Gnosticism. What I'm saying is Turner was writing about the Gnostics before we had the Nag Hammadi library. He's basing his understanding of things on the writings of Irenaeus and Epiphanius and people like that who are attacking Gnostics. So I'm just saying that to set up my point, which is that Turner assumed that Gnostics would have attacked the gospel authorship if they wanted to attack the Orthodox Christians they were opposed to, because that would kind of undercut their authority. And that made sense before we had the Nag Hammadi library, because if you trust what the church fathers say about the Gnostics, it seems like that would be a logical move, but they didn't do it. Therefore, they couldn't do it or whatever. That's a support that they were actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So several points about that. These Gnostics are writing decades later, and so they didn't have any idea who wrote these books any more than the Orthodox had. Second point is Gnostics, contrary to what Turner and everybody else thought before the Nag Hammadi library, the Gnostics, in fact, were not opposed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They used them. Our first commentary of any kind on a gospel text, like an ancient commentary, was written by a man named Heraclian, who was a Valentinian Gnostic. The Gnostics liked the Gospels. Irenaeus and Tertullian actually tell us that they liked the Gospels, because they could use them for their own way. The Gnostics had no trouble using Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John to support their own points of view. And so there's no reason for them to attack the apostolic authorship.
Yeah, I would agree. I did get to actually follow up with Dr. Litwa. I think he's attended some of your classes at Chapel Hill. I know he does.
Yeah, he's my graduate student for a while. Yeah.
Yeah. So I did get a chance to kind of talk to him about this thought. Now, obviously, he says a generalization doesn't seem that the Nag Hammadi library obviously posed a response, though. Tertullian and Irenaeus is obviously responding back to claims that facilities, and as you pointed out, and I think he made the same point that you did, that they weren't really attacking the authors. But I think the question that kind of tied back to facilities, we also see with Marcion, is they represented two different so-called versions of Luke. And when Tertullian is doing his argument, one of the things he pointed out is that when we go to the official, what he referred to as the official churches of Paul, that we find this version of Luke in them. Now, obviously, we don't have a copy of that from the 2nd century, but that's the case that he's making, is that we have all these churches of Paul that seem to be coming up with the same testimony, and they're alluding to the same that we trace back.
Yeah, but he's not talking about the name of the author. And so first thing, Basilides doesn't challenge the authorship. The problem with Basilides is he wrote his own gospel, and it's called the Gospel of Basilides. Unfortunately, we don't have it. We have some references to it in Irenaeus. In terms of Marcion, the interesting thing is Marcion was preparing his version of Luke sometime probably in the 140s, but he doesn't call it Luke. He also doesn't identify the author. We don't know how much he actually doctored his book. The church fathers, especially Tertullian, claim that Marcion butchered it, that he took out all the parts he didn't like and published his own version of it. But it is never called Luke. So it's further evidence that these books were not given names early on.
Now, I do want to ask about the question. I know you said obviously you don't call your books according to Bark. I don't think I do my writings that way either. However, from the church's standpoint, I think we see this in Chrysostom's homily on Matthew. He kind of opens up and he takes a very legalistic approach that obviously when we're talking about Mark, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the according to, at least from what I'm trying to understand, is more of a legal attribution, according to the vantage point
Mhm.
or the testimony. So the designation of according to as opposed to by
Yes.
would be because they're giving a vantage point, which they all recognize that there's differences, there's contradictions that they see. But the reason for that, this is the vantage point according to Matthew. This is
Yeah.
the vantage point according to Mark, who was the scribe, and so forth. So
Yeah.
obviously, those titles do sort of at least infer that these are from the writers Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
No, it's not that. No, the point, when you say that it's presenting the point of view of, that means that it's somebody else representing their point of view. In other words, all of them, the title of these gospels, the full title has to be the gospel according to Matthew. But because, according to Matthew is not a title, even though that's what you often find. But Chrysostom is right. That these are saying that these are the accounts of the gospel from the point of view of Matthew, from the point of view of Mark, Luke, and John. That title does not mean the book that Matthew wrote or that Mark wrote, Luke wrote. It is their perspective on the gospel.
So I have a question in terms of the authorship.
This will
This
be
will
your
be my
last.
last.
Yeah, this will be your last one. Thank you.
Dr. Ehrman, at some point in time, these churches, Antioch, Rome, Alexandria, North Africa, they did receive these texts. So whether they received them in the first century or the second century, that does require a physical transfer. And I know you refer to the Matorian canon, whether it's from Hippolytus or Caius or whoever in Rome.
No, it's not from either. We don't know.
Yeah, from whoever. I think the point is from there, it does kind of illustrate that John had authorized, he had seen the three other gospel authorized. And we see this from Clement as well, that, Peter seemed to authorize Mark's, and this is why it shows up in the churches. So because the transfer of a text is physical, you still have to get all these text in here. Wouldn't the churches be able to testify and carry this down? Is part of why I brought up Augustine. Why would we deny the ability of the churches, the apostle, transfer those records? Whenever they did, they would either understand who they received it from, because that would be physical, or who authorized this. Almost like Paul was sending letters to all those churches. Obviously, they're receiving them, they're collecting them, and they're transferring.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't they be able to take that information and what we see in the end of the second century, when they're not trying to expose themselves, that they're like, this is the testimony that handed down, and this is from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we compare them all, and all the history is the same.
Yeah. Well, so right. So suppose the church in Ephesus receives a copy of the Gospel of Matthew in the year 120. It doesn't have the name Matthew attached to it. That's my entire point. It's a book. It's a gospel. They say, oh, here's a gospel. And so it's their gospel. About 50 years later, 60 years later, somebody says, oh, yeah, Matthew, that's the gospel according to Matthew. Because you got this other one here, and it's different. Why is that? Well, that one's according to Mark. Well, why is this one so different? That one's the according to John. So that whole business of attaching names, it's my whole point. It didn't happen. We don't. It is something that came about later, and so these apostolic attributions are attested to the end of the second century, not before. And that's when it came into existence. It may seem weird to us because we're used to calling them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But in fact, in the ancient world, they weren't called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's accustomed to us because it's been done. That's been happening for 1900 years now.
Excellent. Excellent. All right, Dr. Ehrman, you can now give your questions to Jonathan, and I'll start once you ask yours as well for another 10 minutes. And then audience, get ready. I have starred many. I've gotten some on the side here I'm saving. We'll do the best we can, but go ahead and start getting those questions in for us. We'll save them, and I'm marking them as we go. Thank you.
Okay, so I wonder if you could tell us how you imagine somebody like Matthew getting the education that he needed to write a gospel.
So I think first, and I'm not an expert in this field in languages, so I'm only going to be able to rely on what I've been able to read. But first, a tax collector under the Roman Empire would obviously have to keep records. Which means
Can I just stop you there?
Sure.
Why is that so obvious?
Well, because if he's collecting for the jurisdiction that he's in, and you have to account for those records, obviously he would have to turn those in. That would account for his accounting of what he's collecting.
Have you ever? I don't know. Do you know how tax collecting worked in Rome or in Israel at the time?
No.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, basically, I'll just say, there are three levels. You have the person who's like in charge of the corporation that's doing it. He's like the CEO, and you got in the New Testament, you have Zacchaeus. He's called a chief tax collector in the Gospel of Luke. That means that he's like the guy who organizes the people who are actually doing the work. The people doing the work are the guys who are pounding on your door telling you to give me 10 denarii or whatever and if you don't have it, they break your kneecaps. So most people were that, they're just guys knocking on the door. So I don't know. People always say the tax collector had to be literate, but I don't know why they had to be able to count money.
Yeah, no.
You only gave me 4. I said 5, man. And so I don't know that they had to be literate.
Yeah, I obviously, Rome would want to make sure no one's stealing from them. I think that's
yeah. You can count the money. Yeah.
Yes. And now and obviously I don't want to ask you a question back, but obviously, reading J.N. Sevenster, Dr. Scott Gleaves, Stanley Porter, Paul Barnett, they obviously make an opposite case, and there's obviously evidence.
No. Now, do they? They don't. I don't think you indicated earlier that they said that they could speak some Greek. My question is, how did they get educated to write Greek compositions?
Yes,
because there are different levels of education, and it takes many years to get through them, and it only comes to children of the highly the rich urban elite. So I'm just asking, take John. How does John get this education?
Well, I would say, obviously, in the gospel text itself, there's other people that identify themselves. Hey, we are here with John and writing and testifying. I think it was done at Ephesus.
Why do you think that?
Oh, because we have documentation from Eusebius and his histories that point out
Eusebius is writing 250 years after this. So what evidence does Eusebius cite?
So I believe Eusebius does. I think we have Theophilus of Antioch that refers to it. That we're putting.
When was he living?
Well, yeah, they're much later, but I think one of the things that we kind of rely on from Eusebius, obviously, he was a court historian under Constantine. He was the kind of de facto librarian. So I think what his works do show is that he had access to a lot of sources that were.
Do you trust Eusebius for everything he says?
No, I think what we can see is that there are biases. Obviously, in the Chronicle, he accepts, that, hey, Papias was the hero of John. Obviously, he kind of changed his position on Revelation in his histories. But we can notice it. We can notice these biases, but I think kind of similar.
This seems to me like it'd be a big bias, wouldn't it?
Well,
if you wanted to say that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually wrote, I mean, surely
well,
he'd have a stake in that.
yeah, he would, but I don't think he can force his stake on the churches of Asia Minor. Or
No, but what he's saying is what people have believed for 200 years.
yes, but he did go against all of Asia Minor on Revelation. He does seem to provide an honest assessment of the disputes of authorship. So while he didn't agree with
But these
John,
are not just. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not being disputed, are they?
no. And so this is where when we see all these churches, uh, whether we agree that they're independent or not, they do come to the same conclusion on these four
No,
writings.
they don't all come to the same conclusion. They all accept what somebody else has said. Let me ask this. Let me go back to a question. Why do you think that nobody names them as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John until the end of the 2nd century? They quote them.
Yeah,
Why don't they give them names?
From my perspective is, Christianity very early on was not legal. They are trying to keep a low profile. We know throughout the
They didn't have trouble calling the letters of Paul by Paul.
Well, Paul was a Roman citizen, so he had much more
What's that
right.
got to? No.
Well, so Paul obviously, when he was before Festus and Felix, he appealed to his Roman citizenship.
No, I'm asking why somebody in the year 140 is reluctant to, I mean, I'm not talking about them going before a Roman official saying, I think these were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'm saying why, when they're writing to each other, why don't they call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
Well, I think, from the standpoint, I think they refer to them. They are in Justin. He refers to.
He certainly quotes
Peter.
them. He doesn't quote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, though.
Well, he does. Well, what he does say is that the apostles, and he does connect them with the Gospels. And I do believe, in particular, when he does quote Mark, I think it's chapter 3. So in his dialogue with Typhro, he does mention that it's in Peter's gospel or his memoir.
No, this is in the dialogue. It's in book 106 of the dialogue, and he mentions, he doesn't say Mark. He
refers to the verse that he then.
No, he doesn't refer to the verse. He talks about, he's talking about he says the memoirs, the memoir of Peter, and whenever Justin talks about the death and resurrection of Jesus, it's always, we have a portion of the Gospel of Peter now. It's discovered in the 1880s. And whenever Justin talks about the death of Jesus, the parallels are to the Gospel of Peter rather than to the Gospel of Mark.
Okay. And I think for reference, I think the quote from Typhro is when it is said that Jesus, in brackets, changed the name of one of the apostles to Peter. And when it is written in his memoirs, referring to Peter's memoirs, that this happened as well as his surname. Yeah, so that's what I was kind of referring to.
It's in the Gospel of Peter.
So from my perspective, he has knowledge of those documents. Now, why he's not saying the Gospels and the writings, what I would say is similar to his martyrdom, he's not giving a lot of information out there about the followers, their teaching.
I completely disagree with that. I mean, he describes, for example, how they hold their Eucharist meals. He gives the details, and what happens in their worship services. And
I feel like,
I don't know. He calls them the memoirs of the apostles, but he doesn't call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Correct. Which it's still positive evidence that there's gospels out there in the church.
I know there are gospels out there.
Yeah.
We're asking whether that anybody ever called them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John before the 180s.
My perspective is, you have Irenaeus and Tertullian coming on scene because there's a serious threat at their time, because you have all these competing traditions. I mean, Nag Hammadi, there's probably about 30 plus traditions out there that other people are coming up to say now. So given that it's a hostile environment to Christians, they are in hiding. They can't just openly worship. Now, Tertullian Irenaeus are coming out to give the defense, explaining how they're doing, and they're showing their hand. I think that's what we see. You know, the Christians are being.
I don't see how naming the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John puts them either in more or less trouble. And I think we've really overestimated how much persecution is going on. I'm not alone in this. I mean, the modern scholars about persecution indicates pretty clearly that it's pretty sparse. When it happens, it's not nice.
Yes,
it does happen sometimes, but people were not in hiding. People weren't in the catacombs. Christians were out there. It's well documented, I think. But in any event, whether that's true or not, calling them Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John doesn't make them any worse than just calling them the memoirs of the apostles.
correct. The only thing I would say.
Go ahead and finish that one, Jonathan, and that'll wrap up the section.
Yeah, I think my thought process is, we have all these churches, which, I believe, and I think there's documentation to support from the churches themselves that say, hey, these are our records. We have chain of titles back to the apostles, and even though the documents don't have names on them, every Antioch, Alexandria, they're all coming up with the same name. So it's either
they're not coming up with the same name. They're repeating the same name. They're not independently coming up with this.
Well, yeah, and this is where I probably disagree and say, where are they coming up with the name from? Who shouted it first, and who's following the leader on this?
But all these people you're mentioning know Irenaeus. They've read his work.
I don't think Tertullian.
Decades or.
Tertullian, I don't think there's any indication. I think they're about 900 something miles apart. There's no indication that Tertullian knows the works of. And what he says specifically, I'm appealing to Philippi, Galatia. He says, go to the churches. You'll see the official writings of the apostle, or the authentic writings of the apostles. And he does name Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Yeah. So
in the year 200.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, good job, gentlemen. This isn't a sprint; it's a marathon. I think we got through it. There's tape at the end of the road here. We can get it. We can get through it. All right. Thank you so much. There are some questions. I'm going to ask a couple if I need to repeat them because they won't be on the screen, that came in on different platforms. This one is specifically for both of you, actually, because it's not specified. Tertullian, when stating the issue with Marcion, mentions the fact that Marcion tried to slip the gospel in anonymously, showing that the churches would never have received an anonymous gospel. So I'll start with Dr. Ehrman. I think he's referring to where Tertullian talked about.
Was it Bellica, and I think that's where the Acts of Paul and Bellica. Is that what they're referring to?
I think they're talking about
Asia Minor.
I think possibly so. I think they're referring to against Marcion, book 4, or section 4 and 5 here, because it says, talking about Luke's gospel beginning, but that he tried to actually put the gospel out without a name on it, and therefore the gospels would not have been received from the churches without a name. They would have never just received anonymous letters. I think that's what the question's getting. I don't want to assume. I don't have any evidence.
Okay, so I'm not. I think you wanted me to respond.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's not the thing with him and Paul and Thecla. Paul and Thecla is Tertullian attacking this book and saying that it's a fabrication, not authentic. But what I think what he's talking about is Marcion. Marcion didn't give a name to the gospel. He called it right. He called it the gospel, and he didn't give the name to his 10 Pauline letters. He just called them the apostle. So his canon had 11 books in it, a form of Luke that he called the gospel, and 10 Pauline letters. And so Tertullian, certainly by Tertullian's time, these books are all called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And what Tertullian does in the against Marcion, it's a 5-volume work, still available. People can read it in English translation. He attacks Marcion on all sorts of grounds and comes up with anything he throws in the kitchen sink. I mean, sometimes it's very humorous how vicious he can be and witty. But so one of the many things he's saying is that he didn't even name his gospel. It just shows you can't get away with just an unnamed gospel these days. And So I don't think that's any bearing on, when these gospels were originally called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I will say one of the things about Tertullian that Jonathan, I don't think you'll be very happy with. Is he thought Luke, since Luke, he thought it was written by Luke, the companion of Paul, and he said, so yeah, it wasn't really written by an apostle. It's written by an apostolic man, and so he put it on a second tier. He put Mark and Luke on a second tier because the real gospels are Matthew, John.
There's another one that comes in. Again, both could answer this if they'd like. The Didache, when quoting Matthew's gospel, does not call it the gospel of Matthew, but the gospel of the Lord. Could these gospels be highlighting more of public liturgy, focusing on the teachings of Jesus over against the authors, even if they know who the authors are? Jonathan, you can start, and then I'll go to Dr. I think this is for both of you, actually.
Well, when I look at the Didache, I know Eusebius cites it as a spurious work. Obviously, there's a liturgical work. I think the one thing that, from mine and Dr. Ehrman's perspective, on the Lord's Prayer, I think there's a key textual variant there that can play into some TR readings. But it does have knowledge. The Didache, whether it's 150, I don't know the exact dating. Eusebius attributes it pretty early.
Around 100.
Yeah. 100. What it does show is knowledge of those works that are in circulation. That's what I would say. So the evidentiary value of the Didache is it does represent the gospel of the Lord, which would, from my standpoint, tie back to that being Matthew. He was sort of the scribe of the group. And so that's how I kind of read it on that side. And I think that's the evidentiary value. I think it's positive that the Gospel of Matthew was in circulation at that time, or what we would refer to as the Gospel of Matthew. But those are my thoughts, Dr. Ehrman.
Dr. Ehrman, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I would say later was charged as being spurious, the Didache. The title is the Didache of the 12 Apostles, the teaching of the 12 Apostles, but it's actually not claiming to be written by them. It's claiming to represent their views. And it does quote Matthew and probably Luke in several occasions, but again, it does not identify them. It doesn't say they're written by Matthew and Luke. So absolutely, everybody agrees that they're in circulation. It's not clear, actually, that these quotations are from Matthew and Luke. I mean, it's not obvious. It looks like it. It looks like it. I think they probably are. But this questioner has a really good point, which is that one of the reasons that the Gospels were not named early on, had no names, they were anonymous, people didn't know who had written them, is because they contained teachings of Jesus. And it was the teachings of Jesus that were authoritative. It was only later that books became authoritative. Originally, it's the anonymous teachings, the teachings of Jesus are what mattered, not who wrote them.
All right, we'll go into some of the audience questions here. Let's see here. Question for Jonathan Sheffield. Would the number of contradictions within the four Gospels argue against two eyewitnesses and two associates of eyewitnesses being the authors of the four texts?
I would say no. And I know Chrysostom makes a very good point of this in his homily on Matthew. And this is why you see very early on, I think Tatian's Diatessaron, that the churches were against this idea of trying to harmonize them. So they like the differences in the sense that these are individual writers. I think as Chrysostom puts it, they're writing at different places, under different times, under different circumstances. That's what we expect to see from eyewitnesses, is we want their vantage points, even if they're wrong, is because what we can do then is align the key facts from that standpoint. So that's hopefully I answered the question.
I think so. I don't know if Dr. Ehrman, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll just say that even if people are eyewitnesses, it doesn't mean they don't contradict each other. I don't think that the contradictions themselves indicate much about the authorship. I think there are other things that point against authorship within the Gospels themselves. We didn't get into that.
Okay. We'll go into the next one. This one is question for Dr. Ehrman. If the authorial attestations are later guesses, why does every manuscript make the same exact guess? Why not at least a little disagreement?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I don't think that every manuscript is making the same guess. By the time you start getting the manuscripts with attestations and with titles in them or running headers in them in Greek, they is around it's early third century. So by that time, everybody agreed that they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. People aren't coming up with new names every time. And it's like, why does everybody call the Epistle of Barnabas the Epistle of Barnabas? It doesn't claim to be written by somebody named Barnabas, but that's what everybody calls it. Why? Because at some point somebody said it's written by Barnabas, and there were no other names available. So they, yeah, okay, it's Barnabas. And so I mentioned Barnabas in particular for one reason. I keep coming back to that one is because in early Christianity there were church leaders who thought it was Scripture. It's in some of our ancient manuscripts, and it's always called this. It's always Barnabas. So I don't think that it's a mystery that manuscripts have the same title, because that's once somebody starts calling it that, yeah, why not? Okay, that's who it is.
Yeah, my point on this, and I think you're trying to allude to this point earlier, is they are coming up with the same names. How does
They're
that?
not coming up with the same names. They're repeating the names. Jonathan, I'm not. When Stephen and I refer to you as Jonathan, it's not because we both came up with your name somehow independently of each other.
True. No, I agree with that.
You're called Jonathan.
Yes.
This book was called Matthew. Okay, it's Matthew. They're not coming up with a name every time.
Yeah, when I look at this question and Irenaeus is saying, well, this is what all the churches are saying, and he's obviously trying to understanding that from an independent standpoint. This is what they're all saying.
Yeah, 100 years later, they all agree what the names are.
Yeah.
You want to move on to the next one, Jonathan?
I
don't want to interrupt you. I don't want to interrupt you.
No.
All right.
I promise we won't solve this today.
Question for Dr. Ehrman. Do any of the Socratic dialogues claim internally that they were written by Plato? Now, this was pretty early on. I think this is probably in reference to Jonathan's slides. I don't want to assume here just because
No, it's a good.
Okay.
He's asking. I was saying it's a very good question. I was saying that there's nothing internally to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to make you think they're written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And he's saying, well, what about the Socratic dialogues? Is there anything where they claim it? And no, the dialogues of Plato, which have Socrates as the main character, absolutely don't. Inside of them, they don't claim Plato's writing them. Plato actually talks about himself in the third person in a number of them. He's actually one of the people present in them, and so it's part of his literary style.
Jonathan, anything on that about the literary style?
Scribes can imitate a number of literary styles, so I don't think it's conclusive on the question of authorship. And I think here the point I was referencing in Lucretius doesn't technically identify himself in the work. I know he references a figure. I know his dedication. I mean, in the same regard, but an author who brings their work in, and this is why, tying back to the apostles, if Peter, authorized this work in there, the churches of the first century would recognize that, and that's where they would. And this is what I'm saying. They're coming from. They would say, "Hey, Peter authorized this in the churches. This is from Peter."
That's what they would have said, and they don't say it. So, So the Lucretius is a great example because of the way books were distributed in the ancient world. Lucretius writes on the nature of things, and the way normally you write a book is the way you share it with somebody. You get a group of your friends around and you read it to them, and then you give them copies, and then they give people copies. They give copies, and everybody knows it's Lucretius. So Cicero, who's a contemporary, lives at the same time, knows it's Lucretius, and that's precisely what you do not have with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's my point. You don't have people who are contemporary with them saying, yeah, this is Matthew's. It's not for another 120 years.
There is a follow-up with the third person portion here. I guess this is again open for anybody. There are other writings that states like with Plato where they do refer to themselves on the scene in the third person. Could that also not be true of the Gospels and their
Yes.
authors?
Certainly could be. Of course.
Okay. Jonathan, anything there?
Yeah, no, it's good. I think sometimes the internal case is kind of different. I mean, as Dr. Ehrman alluded to before, you do have a lot of textual traditions out there from other groups that do actually name, hey, this is from Peter, so the name itself on a side doesn't constitute like, hey, that's authority. It must be from Peter. It has its name on. I would say, in that regard, this is where if they brought it into public notice and if it's true what Irenaeus or them say about Papias, he was a hero of John the Apostle. I know there's this debate over one or two or multiple Johns or what I call the Spartacus effect. But if the elders, and John is one of them and he's sharing this testimony, obviously that's how we can get that attribution. Or if he had records in his church that say, hey, the people who received this earlier years ago, this is where it's coming from in our registers. But
okay. Another question comes in for Jonathan here. Would it affect your faith in any way if you knew for sure the Gospels were all secondhand? That's a fair question. All right.
Yes. And the reason I would say that, because obviously, if there's secondhand testimony, I believe, Dr. Ehrman goes into this in some of his scholarship. Obviously, you're further from the truth. Are these legends that are kind of growing? Do they become mythicized in the sense that, hey, we're starting to add all these things, these new teachings, what we believe? So what you now have is sort of an evolutionary tale. I think, come up to John and you have this great theological work. You have the Gospel of Thomas and it all starts to feel very mythologized, or, that they're making these stories up. They're adding to the legends. And so I think if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I think the basis of setting up this question for Dr. Ehrman and I is, if they are who they say they are, at least on the ground, is you have eyewitnesses. Now, they could all be lying. They could be all making stuff up. But I think the basis, if they're not.
If they are who they say they are? They don't say who they are.
Oh, no. But I'm saying if they did. So if we knew.
But they don't.
No. They don't say
that. I think what this shows is that you really do have a stake in this question, and that if you're wrong, it's going to affect very many things in your personal life and your faith. I have no stake at all. I mean, it wouldn't matter to me. I mean, what would it matter to me? I mean, the Matthew, Mark would still have contradictions, whoever wrote them. And so I'm just asking this historically. And so I know if you're on the witness stand, Jonathan, and the prosecuting attorney found out that, you have a good reason to affirm that alibi.
Well, let me turn that question just out of curiosity to Dr. Ehrman over here. Should it affect generally people who believe in the scripture?
No.
Should that shake their faith just generally?
No. It's why I started the way I did by saying I don't think it should, because it's got no bearing on questions of whether these are religiously true, whether they come from God, whether they are accurate. It's got no bearing on that. These are attributions that were made 100 years later. And so it has no bearing on whether they're inspired or not, for example.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think this will probably come up bigger when we discuss the resurrection. I think there's elements.
Well, that matters. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's different.
That's Jonathan. Is that your cue for me to give a plug for the next debate? Because that's how I took that. It's like, hey, Stephen's doing a terrible job at telling about the next one. You jumped the gun, but okay. Now that we're on the discussion, we will be having another debate between the two on the panel, Dr. Ehrman and Jonathan, coming up in the bitter end of the cold weather. That'll be coming up in March.
Not here in Texas. It won't be
cold. Well, not everybody's in Texas, Jonathan. I know y'all are the big state down there, but no, that'll be coming up as well. I'll give an announcement for that in a minute. There was another question for Dr. Ehrman, kind of tying into something you just said a minute ago as well. If the traditional attributions are either best guesses or false, do we have any disagreement, such as Matthew being attributed to James or somebody else?
No.
Okay.
But it's for the reasons I said. I mean,
Right.
you know, there are no disputes about a lot of anonymous writings that get somebody attributes them. Somebody called First Clement. They called it Clement, and it's just like it wasn't when it was written, and it wasn't like right away. Later, somebody called it Clement. Everybody said, "Okay, it's called Clement," so they started calling it Clement. So there weren't disagreements. There's no reason to disagree with it.
Okay. And we're going to try to fast track some of these. For Jonathan, can chain of custody be used to prove that the authors wrote their respective gospels if there's no proof they possess the manuscripts, much less wrote them themselves?
So, obviously, Irenaeus and Tertullian are arguing this particular point against the Gnostics, who had made similar such claims for the writings in their possession. Now, we do know by the end of the middle to the end of the 2nd century, these records are in the possession of the vast majority of these churches. I mean, the Diatessaron is doing something in Aramaic at that time. So they are in the possession of the churches. The question is, where did they get them from? And part of the chain of custody is if it was received by Matthew in Jerusalem, because if he published it in Jerusalem, there was a vibrant church over there. We have Antioch. If he brought that into public circulation, the Church of Jerusalem can testify to the receipt of that publication. And they're keeping records, or their chain of titles, documenting the possession of that text that have come down. And we see this in a number of the fathers that, they're appealing to what has come down in the churches. Well, yes, then these records, the chain of titles or chain of custody, would tie back to that original receipt of that transaction. So I would say yes. Now, I know Dr. Ehrman is going to disagree, but this is what they argued at the end of the 2nd century.
But
if you want to say something,
I'll just say, you say we know that they had these records. You're taking church fathers at their word on that. That's what Tertullian said. But you're a legal guy, you're a law guy. You can't just take witnesses at their word when they say something you agree with, and then don't take them at their word when you disagree with them.
I would agree.
So when somebody says something, you need to look up evidence if it's right or not. So if Tertullian says there are records, what evidence is there that he's right there? But he's wrong about the other things he says, that there's no record. So it's using church fathers as a matter of convenience rather than actually trying to find evidence.
Yeah, and probably to clarify, what they've presented is documentation to kind of support their claim.
Oh, what's Tertullian documentation that these churches have records?
Well, he does quote that Peter was appointed. He does write about the process and prescription.
No, he states the idea, and he says, "Oh, this is proved by the records in their churches." Well, that's not evidence.
I would say that Irenaeus at least appeals. He does cite a list that he had access to, and he says all the churches had it. But we do find these documents in and whether they're putting up fake or forged documents. You see
Irenaeus is flat out wrong about what he says a number of things about the Gnostics. He's just demonstrably wrong. And so it means that sometimes he's right, sometimes he's wrong. So if you think he's right in a particular place, you can't just quote him and say, therefore he's right.
No. I think my point is, in the matter of, can Irenaeus speak on records that he's a bishop over at a particular church? He was in Asia Minor. Can he give insight into how the churches were set up and organized? And I think there's value there for him as a witness, as a bishop in a church, of Gaul. He spent time in Asia Minor. He could tell us, here's the processes they had around record keeping.
Okay. I want to fast track just a few of them. We've got about 7 minutes, so I just want to get some of these in. Aaron says, question for Bart, thoughts on recent scholarship pushing back dating of the Gospels to the 2nd century? I've seen some as late as 120. I would actually say I've seen them later than that, but yes.
Yeah. It seems unlikely to me because we can date authors who are quoting them before that. I think the Didache, I think certainly Ignatius. I think Ignatius knows Matthew. And I think that the Didache quotes Luke and Matthew. And I think they were floating around. I understand this moved back. It's especially Gospel of Luke. People are dating later, but I'm personally not convinced.
Okay. And it says at facts question, does Dr. Ehrman think that Marcion's copy of the canonical Luke had a title before editing? And I'm going to assume that's a key word there, before editing.
Well, it didn't have one before or after, but no, I don't think it did.
Agreed. Okay.
Yeah, we don't have copies of it. So
No. All right. Is Bart claiming Irenaeus made up?
No.
Okay. So you don't
I
think
don't think he made him up. It's what was circulating by the year 185. It's what anybody who called these gospels, that's what they called them. They weren't calling them in 150, but they were calling them in 185.
Okay. This would be a good question for both of you as well, but we'll start with Dr. Ehrman since it's addressed to him. Is there room for Maurice Casey's theory of an Aramaic original underlying Catamark written in 40 CE or so?
No. So, I mean, Maurice Casey was a good scholar, but the Aramaic thing doesn't work. And it doesn't work for Matthew either, by the way. These books were, any serious linguistic analysis today done by philology will tell you these things were written in Greek.
Jonathan?
Yeah, no, I would agree with Bart's point on gospel. The only thing I would say is they were Aramaic areas. Antioch was half Syrian, Edessa. So there would be a need for an Aramaic version of these gospels. And I think, Tatian, he's doing his best to do a harmony for an audience that requires some sort of Aramaic version of these documents. So I think
maybe it's not clear whether the Diatessaron was in Greek or Syriac. There's a big debate about that.
Yeah.
And the need for something, I mean, I don't think there's any evidence of Syriac translations of things until the end of the 2nd century.
All right, we got another one here. Question for Sheffield. If Matthew was Jesus' disciple, why did he feel the need to copy 93% of Mark verbatim instead of telling his own account?
Well, my thoughts on this is that what we see between the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is there's a common source. And I think that common source would be Peter. Obviously, if it was Matthew, he was with Peter at the events. So they're basically seeing the same. They're seeing the same information, if that is true of the case. So I think there's a common source there. Obviously, Augustine saw it a little different on the reverse, who's borrowing from who. But I think there's a common source. And I think this is why you see a lot of the same information. If Dr. Ehrman and I were there at the, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, on that hill, I think we would give a pretty similar case of the event. And I think with Matthew and
Jonathan, just to clarify,
let me respond. Let me respond.
Hold that thought right there. Just to clarify, are you saying that you don't? Their audience is blown up. Are you saying that you don't think Matthew used Mark?
No, I know I defended this position against Dr. Mark Goodacre. Obviously, I hold to Math and Priority as the first gospel published. So, and that's probably why some of the confusion. So, I have defended that thesis that Matthew was first, Now, what I would say is that there is a common source. Peter's
So you
the
don't think
source.
that Mark got his thing from Peter? You think he got it from Matthew?
That no, Mark did get it from Peter.
Okay. So Jonathan, let me tell you what this is be like. Suppose both Stephen and I, when we're done in a few years, write down our experiences of today. How likely is it we're going to have paragraphs after paragraph that are verbatim, word for word the same to describe what we just experienced? How likely is that?
Yeah, it's probably
It is humanly not possible. It will not happen. And so you can't say that Peter was the common source and that they both, like years later, they both wrote it down. And it just happens that they've got paragraphs that are word for word the same. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, no, once again, if I have to go off of, what documentation I have available, I do feel, not to take it off track, but obviously the movement started in Israel. They didn't get to Rome to probably about 13 or 14 years later. It makes sense that the early Jewish converts that were there in Jerusalem would need some form of documentation to promote their narrative before it gets over to Mark. And I'm tying in the fact that, all right, Mark gets there with Peter, Simon Magnus come in. They want to control the narrative. Let's get a narrative out there that we can do that. So I think
you're not responding to the point. The point is they got verbatim agreements.
Yeah. And I think some of the stuff that I don't know. Okay, did Matthew, as described, take notes? And this is what Peter is going off of his sermons. No, I understand that the difficulty. I think in what you're saying, the verbatim.
Yeah.
But if Peter is the common source for Matthew, if he relied on Peter, and Mark, from what the document is, that he's relying on Peter, basically the same source and the same information.
Are you imagining that Matthew's going around with a scroll and a pen, and that when Jesus is talking, Matthew's writing?
He could have.
Where do you? Well, he could have used a word processor, as far as I know. But I mean, what evidence do you have that he was doing? Is there any ancient source that says that?
Well, I think we see, not that the Didache kind of infers or applies that the gospel of the Lord appeals, but we do see it.
Matthew taking notes.
Well, when we look at the Gospel of Matthew, and we see the Pharisees and the scribes, there's all these mentions of scribes. Someone's taken down what he's saying, because obviously they're going to use it against them.
Who are Jewish scribes?
Well,
they're experts in scripture. They're the ones who copy the Torah in Hebrew.
My point is that there's been writing in that area for an incredibly long time. I don't know if we can rule out the idea that Matthew or someone else could have been writing down a lot of this information.
Let's not rule it out. So what's the evidence?
Well, we don't, I don't have any specific documentation apart from what has come down. So I am making an assumption there. We know that there's been writing in the area. There were scribes following these groups. I think even, Luke or in the Gospel of Luke, where it references other Gospels, obviously it can refer to Matthew, Mark. It could refer to other stuff that was out there in publication, because people were dictating, what was being said or information.
Yeah, I don't think you should come up with theories there's no support to, because they coincide with what you want to think.
Well, no, I'm trying to find at least explanations for, Matthew.
Scribes didn't write Greek.
Well, I know that's a debate. Did Peter, did he? And it's hard. I know there's others that make a case that he could have. I would say maybe.
I'm gonna interject here because I don't want to. No, I don't want. Well, we agreed to a time limit, and I'm trying to be very, very, very careful here because we're technically over.
We blew that one out of the water a long time ago.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to be respectful. There's questions that came in that we just can't get to. I think there's. I will say kind of if you guys want to kind of close it out with this, because a lot of the questions are coming in outside of YouTube that are dealing with the source that would make more sense that keeps getting referred to as the earlier Matthew is not our Greek Matthew, but this Hebrew Aramaic. I think Dr. Ehrman mentioned Papias's quote of it. You guys talked about it as well, that whatever form that's primary that Jonathan's referring to could be an Aramaic Hebrew account that we don't have anymore. Not the Greek account.
I guess
no. They're referring to the quote of Papias where it says that Matthew wrote it in a Hebrew dialect, which is not Greek. And then also Clement and others say the same thing. So that's something that's being tossed around on the side with other audiences that are corresponding in group chats.
So it's a good point because the earlier question has to do with that because
yes, it does.
Matthew is verbatim the same as Mark, and you can't get that if it's a translation.
So there you go. All right, gentlemen, good work. Thank you for surviving with us, audience. We've gone exactly 2 hours and 30 minutes. Man, I should get a raise. All right.
We'll double your salary. What's 2 times 0?
Yes. I'll triple it.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to put you gentlemen behind stage. Thanks for being good sports. All right, folks. Thanks for joining this debate. If you have anything you want to add later, put it in the comments. We'll come behind it and I'll try to evaluate as much as possible. Thanks for being good sports in there as well. There's links for you to click on. If this is your first time joining FACTS, FACTS is an acronym for Fathers, Apocrypha, Canon, Text, and Scripture, kind of a play on. Feel free to like this video, but also subscribe to the channel and see what kind of other content has been put out as well. But as always, for those that join this audience, grace and peace to you. God bless.